Welcome back. As we discussed in the previous lecture, individual in-depth interviewing requires a lot of skill and technique on the part of the interviewer. But what I didn't mention, and we absolutely need to acknowledge, is that even the best interviewers can be undercut by a lousy research design. And so it's important for us to take a step back and think about how to design a good IDI study before we ever sit down with a participant and begin asking questions. So let's first begin on agreeing what it takes to conduct a good interview. And I'd argue that a good qualitative interview isn't just some exercise in which you ask a bunch of questions and pause to let someone else talk before you move on. It's about listening to the answers and then ensuring that you're drawing out the best quality of information possible. And this listening aspect, it's really important because a lot of times in interview subjects are really struggling to articulate their thoughts in a clear and concise manner. And as the interviewer, you're going to have to help draw them out in what they want to say and put it into terms that are actually useful. Being willing to follow up on a stray thought or to get someone to expound upon a partial comment is a very important aspect of many styles of qualitative interviewing, but it requires being in the moment with your participant and keeping a good conversational flow going. Now, in order to accomplish that flow, it's important to design the interview to utilize questions that are truly open-ended and to also build in some probing questions that can be used to go deeper on topics of interest. And when I say open-ended, one of the first things that means is that you have to be very careful not to present questions in a way a quantitative design might, where you're suggesting what the answers should be. The yes-no styles of questioning or scales that we often use in quant are something that we should be really averse to using in qual because they do not allow people to open up or speak about their experience. And a construction like, have you ever shopped at the store? Leads naturally to a single answer word of yes or no. But a construction like, tell me about the experiences you've had with this store, still elicits whether or not a participant's actually shopped there, but it also gives them more space to expound upon what the context behind that shopping might have been, or not. And even when the people haven't shopped there are bound to tell you why they haven't, you can structure a probe for those who don't have direct experience to get them to explain why they haven't shopped there in the event that you need to hear about it. So writing a good interview guide also means trying to find a balance between something that feels like it was meant to be read and something that feels more conversational. It's important to listen to how people speak in natural settings and to try to understand the differences in cadence. There are times in an interview where you want things to sound like they're being read, like when you're giving instructions or when you're asking certain questions or when you're providing stimuli. There are also times where you want to sound more conversational, like when you're building rapport early on, or when you're asking a follow-up question, or when you're turning back a question on a participant. The best interviews often feel collaborative and conversational to the participant. They often have a funny way of feeling like you, as the interviewer, contributed a lot more to the discussion than you actually did. One of the things my company president and business partner, David Rich, has always pointed out to me is that people love talking about themselves, and they often misremember a conversation about themselves to be more of a two-way interaction. I remember one time David was interviewing a board member for an organization, and David said very few words to him, and the guy talked almost the entire time. And as David was walking away, when he was finished, he heard the guy say, "Boy, that David Rich, he's quite a conversationalist." And David thought that was very funny, given that he had said very little. As interviewers, though, we can use that to our advantage. So often when you're interviewing, you're going to hear stories, which we also call anecdotes, and they can be really useful for your broader purposes, but they can also become a big distraction. And I'll be honest here in saying that while I love hearing stories, and a lot of clients do too, because they are engaging and they're often interesting, in truth, a lot of stories don't quite get the details right, and they're often oversimplified. I've had experiences where someone's told a story about a customer service experience in an in-depth interview, and the person who was on the other end of that experience is actually observing the research or they're reading through the data, and they remember the specifics, and then they want to tell me the other side, often with a lot more knowledge about what actually happened. That kind of encounter can really damage the participant's credibility and harm the research, because basically the inclination there is, well, if they were saying that, they probably don't know what they're talking about, and should we listen to anybody in that case? So we have to be careful about, when we're hearing these stories, acknowledging that there's a difference between perception and reality. Some participants can also relate stories that are from a secondary source, which we would also call hearsay. And while they're interesting and they do tell us something about the participants, particularly in how they perceive a brand or company or service or whatever, they're also dangerous for us to accept at face value because they're not from that primary source. There's something that they heard. They might be an urban legend. They might be misremembering a different brand or a different service encounter. They might be getting things mixed up and not quite having all of the details correct. Those stories still have an influence on them, but we need to be careful about accepting them as truth. So it's important to be deliberate about designing questions to elicit stories where we want to hear them and to specify where we don't want or need them, particularly if we know participants are likely to begin telling them in places where they're not of use or of interest to us. And I often tell participants at the beginning of an interview to hold off on telling stories about certain topics because it saves us a lot of time and frustration later on, since I don't have to then cut them off and say it's time to move on. And when you have to cut people off mid-interview and tell them it's time to move on, that often shuts them down and they're not as excited about sharing things in the next lines of questioning that you use. But as qualitative researchers, we also do have another trick up our sleeves. Ensuring that we design our interviews to be administered in the same way to every participant or using a structured or semi-structured approach can help us to ensure that we ask the same questions of everyone and elicit the same opportunities for storytelling in the same places in the survey. This allows us to assemble those stories into a broader set of data where we can look for common themes among the stories and then provide a deeper and more useful analysis that allows us to go beyond the anecdotal and find patterns that can be more useful to us. This brings us to 4 different types of interview designs. And the first of these is called a structured design, where we ask the same exact questions of everybody with very little or no deviation. This is often used for the most scientific approaches where we want to limit the role of individual interviewing styles with our data as much as possible. Government surveys use these a lot. Medical surveys use these a lot. A structured approach usually involves written questions and probes to tell the interviewer exactly what to say, and it's generally heavily scripted, right down to how they introduce it and how they close it out and where there are signposts telling people how far along in the survey they are. It's all scripted in there. The problem with it is that it does not allow the interviewer to easily chase down stray thoughts or to explore half answers unless the designer accounted for it, and the participants often feel like the design is so impersonal that it feels really robotic and formal as a result. That's why the semi-structured approach, which uses a formal guide with written probes, but which allows the interviewer some levity in asking follow-up questions or restating questions if they're not clear, is a more desirable approach for many qualitative interviewers. And it can really feel quite conversational in design because you're able to deviate from the script a little bit, but it also still builds a broader data set from all of the interviews that are conducted. Semi-structured approaches are limited, though, by the individual interviewer's style, and so they're often best recommended for research where a single interviewer or a team of very similar in style interviewers are administering the research to help limit those effects. You get the spontaneity of something that's less structured, but you still have that ultimate structure in place that gives you a good data set. And it's just about making sure that you're then including a very common practice of interviewing among anybody that's involved. A third approach is an unstructured interview, where the interviewer has a lot of dot points or questions that are used more as kind of a helpful guide to the interviewer rather than as a plan for the actual interview. Unstructured interviews tend to be used in situations where the interviewer has a strong sense of what needs to be learned, but isn't quite sure what questions need to be asked to get there. They're often used in expert interviews, so if you're talking to somebody that's really knowledgeable or who is an expert in a field, or in very small qualitative studies that are primary exploratory. So if you're talking to a few customers just to kind of understand the broad strokes of a topic. I often liken them to those of a more journalistic style of interview because journalists usually start off with a few questions and then listen very closely for opportunities to follow up or ask their subjects to clarify things. And certainly when I worked in the field of journalism, this was a style of interview I often used. I'd have notes about what I wanted to ask, and then I would have a notepad where I would jot down things that I heard, and I'd constantly be flipping pages trying to figure out what do I need to ask and have I gotten the information to get there. Then there's the informal interview, which is the most conversational style of the bunch, but probably the least useful for creating actual data because the interviewer goes in without any prepared questions and just sort of wings it. And a good example would be sitting down for coffee with someone and asking them to give you advice on a topic because they know a lot about it and you don't know much about it. And it can be useful and even quite insightful, but that conversation as a whole is probably more about provoking thoughts than it is about getting detailed information. These interviews are great for obtaining background information or for just getting a sense of the boundaries and broad strokes of a topic. They're great for getting advice, but they tend to produce very unreliable data and are heavy on anecdotes, and they're difficult to directly compare. So typically the way that a qualitative researcher would use these is as background or as something that is intended to be heavily exploratory before doing a more structured type of study. Now, each of these designs I just mentioned also requires different levels of understanding about the study's research objectives, which are used to design the lines of questioning that appear in the interview. Generally, structured and semi-structured designs don't require the interviewer to know a lot about why the research is being conducted. They can just ask questions and focus on getting good answers. But less structured approaches require the interviewer to know a lot about what's important to the end users of the data. And whether it's reflected in your interview guide design or in the course of the interviewing itself, it's important to ensure that your data collection is guided by your research objectives, and that there is some understanding behind what is and is not important to know how to address those objectives. It's also important to think carefully about the sorts of answers a line of questioning might receive and how you can follow up on vague or incomplete answers. Planning out your probing questions in advance is really helpful. And you can also utilize a number of different exercises to get participants to start an answer with a written note or a stimulus and then expound upon it so they can move past their initial vagueness. I recommend practicing any interview design on a real human being before employing it on broader study. You'll often find that your design does not do as good of a job in practice as it did in conception, and practice does help you to smooth out rough edges and ensure that you're probing at a much more appropriate moment than you might have initially thought. I'd also recommend being very cautious about trying to utilize unusual gimmicks or tricks to get people to speak up. There are many practitioners out there who have found ways to get people to speak, which they're all too happy to recommend, but which, I'm just being honest here, often boil down to manipulating participants through provocation or stimulation. So there's a difference between giving tips on how to get people to open up and then giving tricks or gimmicks that do the same thing. And a good example would be asking people to talk about their favorite food items, but first showing them very appealing photographs of food to get them thinking about the topic. Now, this sounds good in theory, and actually this technique is called priming, and it actually is used in practice for some styles of research and can be very successful. But the danger of utilizing it as a trick or as a gimmick is it can have an unpredictable effect on the participants and on the data that you collect. In this case, you might be showing participants attributes, features, or categories of things that they'll bring up in the interview because those ideas are fresh rather than because they're top of mind in a normal setting. And these things might in the interview seem really important to them because they've just been thinking about them, but in truth, they probably aren't deciding factors or criteria for them when they're making an actual decision. Another gimmick that sounds good on paper is to build moments of drama or mystery to engage the participants and then to reveal something to them midway through the interview. So maybe you hint mysteriously that you're going to be showing them something really neat later on or things like that. And maybe you get up and walk around the room and try to get them to give a more emphatic answer. Or there's all kinds of other kind of theatrical techniques that you could use. And they all sound really cool on paper, but the truth is they create a situation where the interview can become anxious or uncomfortable for the participant and maybe even make them question if the research is legitimate. They might start looking around for hidden cameras or trying to figure out if they're being provoked or manipulated because somebody is more concerned about getting them in a state where they're going to do something unpredictable than because they actually care about what they have to say. There are also ethical considerations involved here which need to be explored. In general, these sort of techniques don't work out well in practice and they can even disrupt the research. So I would recommend not trying to utilize them. Rather, stick to good lines of questioning and avoid gimmicks or tricks whenever possible. If you're going to use a technique you're not familiar with, do some due diligence and consult the literature and other practitioners before you employ it so you can make sure you're aware of the effects on your data. By the way, this is also true with utilizing technology. A very common technique that's been used in the last few years is to put tablets in people's hands and to have them interact with the research through polls or quizzes that pop up on the tablets or exercises that pop up on the tablets. Sounds really good in theory, but there are effects of that on the research. And one of those effects might be that they're more interested in using the tablet to tell you what they think than to actually expound upon what they think in a group setting or in an interview setting. So be very careful about employing those kinds of tools without first thinking through the implications of them. Always consider the comfort of your participant when you're designing an interview. That is really important for ensuring you get the best quality of data. And if all of this seems overwhelming already, don't worry. We're going to talk about some of the ways in which we design questions. We're going to talk about good techniques and tips for interviewing. And we're going to really try to wrap it all up in the next few lectures so that you are armed with a great set of tools to go out and do your own interviewing.